18. We're going to be talking about climate action and the NDCs, along with the private sector and non-governmental actors. It is very relevant for us because along this fight, we have to get the valuable input of every party. That's why we have a lot of panelists today from every type of sector. We have also Jerome Malabel, who is a global coordinator for the NDC Action. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today to open this talk because it's very important. Thank you very much here today. In this critical moment in which we face climate challenges who are very urgent, it is fundamental for businesses to have a key play in these initiatives and strengthening resiliency. It is a vital commitment to achieve our climate goals at a national and international level. The ambition is a fundamental pillar for climate action, and the private sector has to do its part in the innovation of clean energy. This not only benefits the planet and our communities, but also helps open new opportunities for development, both economically and competitiveness. It is relevant to highlight that we also have to adapt to ensure resiliency in businesses facing climate change. The success against climate change calls for planning in the long term. And this leads to investment in technologies low in carbon, a transition towards renewable energies, and integrating sustainability along the value chain. It also entails the formulation of robust development plans to ensure continuity in a world that is characterized by ever-changing climate. The UNEP is very committed in supporting the private sector in its climate initiatives through projects in the region in which we offer guidance, technical assurance, and financing to help government the transition into a low carbon and more resilient development plan. NDC Action and NDC 5, financed by the German government, and the NDCs are two very important projects of the UNEP that support, along with technical partners, the International Climate Initiative and CGCF, to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to implement their NDCs in partnership with the private sector. Those parties are Costa Rica, Argentina, and Colombia, and El Salvador, Honduras, the Dominican Republic from NDC 5. We encourage them to seize the resources and the experiences to boost the private commitment. We have to recognize that the climate actions from the private sector have a global reach. In Latin America and the Caribbean, they play a role which is essential in building a more sustainable and resilient future. Regional cooperation and best practice exchange are tools that are very powerful to achieve this goal. In this event, we hope to develop concrete strategies and hear inspired examples on how the private sector can contribute significantly to the implementation of the nationally determined contributions of each country and another of the climate goals, both at the national and international level. I really want to thank you for being here today and your engagement, because I think it will provide us very valuable information. Jerome, thank you very much. And we are very excited to hear all this input. We are also going to have Fabiana Rodriguez here, which is a coordinator in the UNEP. Thank you. Good day to everyone hearing and participating today from the private sector and government that are here today. Also, the civil society, academia, and I want to thank all speakers today. And also, I want to extend a salutation to Jerome and our colleagues in the regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean in the UNEP for inviting us in this very important event in the route to COP28. I also want to thank for the support in Panama. And as I said, my name is Fabiana Rodriguez. I am a center coordination for Latin America and the Caribbean in name of the UNFCCC. Today, we're going to address different perspectives of climate action in the private sector and also of other parties to meet the NDCs in the region. It's an honor to be here today, and I want to highlight especially that the role of other actors and businesses outside of the public sector are fundamental for advancing the NDCs. And many times we undermine these efforts. So we want to highlight it today. There's a lot of businesses implementing plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And for many of them, this is a comprehensive approach into their climate action initiatives. We also want to recognize that climate change is interconnected with a lot of other factors like water management, energy, and food. And therefore, it's fundamental that businesses respond to these challenges that are interconnected in their production processes. In terms of the UN framework to combat climate change, government has also a lot of opportunities to participate in the implementation under the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to talk about some of them, like the support to private and public research and adaptation to climate change by giving financing and technical support, including investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, also intelligent agriculture, and other opportunities, as well as participating in the market. The private sector can participate in the market mechanisms that have been established under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that has been known as the clean mechanism. They have been set by the Paris Agreement to allow businesses to finance projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in exchange for other benefits. We can also see them collaborating with the private and public organizations, NGOs, and other actors to implement climate action initiatives, including public-private partnerships to develop innovative solutions, share best practices, and boost technology transfers. Also, it's key to participate in dialogues and negotiations. The private sector is key in this because they can, under the convention, give their input, including participation in the COPs, the Conference of Parties, and in climate groups in the World Balance of Climate in Dubai this year, where the countries will have a dialogue in what we have achieved so far and also create a new route to guarantee that we will lower into adequate levels the greenhouse gas emissions. So also the reports of emissions, the private sector can report their greenhouse gas emissions and make real commitments to reduce climate change. They can make their reputation better doing so and also meet with consumer expectations on this matter. It is fundamental, therefore, to have a comprehensive approach to identify answers that can be mutually beneficial and incorporate synergy into business planification. Before ending, I want to talk about the regional centers for collaboration, better known as the RCCs, which are a network of offices in various parts of the world for the framework to collaborate more closely with NGOs, governments, investors, and governmental entities, among others, to further the NDCs. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have two centers, one in Panama that services the 17 countries, and the other has 16 countries under their charge. In Panama, we work alongside UNAP in their office, and in the Latin American Center, we also give practical expertise not only to parties, but also other actors that are not part of the public sector to meet their climate goals. So we work in adaptation, mitigation, and transparency, mediums of implementation, and also collaborating with the private sector. Today's event gives us the opportunity to explore the necessary partnerships between not only the private sector, but also other key actors to implement effectively the NDCs in Latin America and the Caribbean, and to foster the contributions of the private sector and other actors to further the goals of the NDCs. It's very important to recognize the interconnected risks and collaborate to set ambitious goals towards sustainability. From the RCC Latin America, we hope that this association is very relevant to you and that it will help you access climate action in the region. Thank you very much for assisting, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you, Fabiana. And it's very important, a lot of the elements that you mentioned today, and precisely to further this and give larger context to the people, we have Laura Mora, who is the coordinator for NDC Action in Costa Rica. Tell us how all these actions are articulated with the private sector. Laura, please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you. I'm going to talk about today about the context. Before talking about strategies, we need to understand where the private is at in regards to climate action and meeting the NDCs. But before that, I would like to start with a prompt, which I think is very relevant. There is no climate action without the private sector. Most processes that go in our economy are related some way or another with the private sector. So only understanding this, we will understand the importance that the private sector has towards meeting the NDCs. And although they are the responsibility of each country, the private sector is a great contributor to this. Well, most greenhouse emissions come from private companies. And not only that, but also technological innovation, financial resources, adoption of new practices, and adaptation are also going to rely on any action by the private sector. And due to this, it is relevant for the private sector for them to have the awareness of the irreversible impact that climate change will have on human activities and why it is necessary for us to adapt. So, against this backdrop, we can put into numbers the representation of climate action in this sector. We cannot find that many data on sectors that include the impact in terms of climate change alone. And that is why it is reported the inventory of greenhouse gases at a global level. But looking at this chart that represents the global emissions, we know that most emissions come from the energy sector. So we can break down this information by the energy used by industries. It's the greater representation, along with transport, which is a lot of times used in industrial or business sectors. And a lot further, we can see the energy used in buildings. We have a large quota in this, and they are also linked with agriculture, farming, land use, and forestry. So, from this perspective, we can see that we have a great commitment from the different sectors in the greenhouse gas emissions. What is interesting here, and what is the most challenging aspect? We are asking the private sector at this time that they invest and direct resources directly into climate action. This is a moment in which the economic global context is very challenging. It's record. Even though recession has been slowing down, the prospect of economic recovery is a bit low, right? A lot of economists globally, which are very recognized, are saying that we hope the economy recovers or even weakens during the last year. We're still recovering from COVID. We have a supply crisis in a lot of countries. Inflation is skyrocketing. And the geopolitical context is very complicated as well. There's a lot of political uncertainty. To this, we have to add all the climate issues we have to face. So, in such a challenging moment, we are asking the private sector to invest in climate action. That's just to put things into context. So, how can we involve the private sector into the implementation of NDC? Like Fabiana said, we need to know that currently the private sector has engagement. But the question is whether it is enough. And if we have to find a way to fast track these commitments. But it also has to be beneficial to the private sector, all these contributions, because seeing the work we do with the private sector, the questions are how much will it cost and how much will I gain? If they don't get any benefits from fostering climate action, it's a bit utopical. So about six 653 billion are invested right now in climate action. It's a bit complex, thick chart, but almost 50% or even more of investment currently come from the private sector, which is the orange sector of the chart. The rest are multilateral inputs by organizations or government inputs. To see where this investment goes, you will see that almost 100% is focused in mitigation actions. And there's also two main sectors, the energy and transport sectors. What can we get from this? That effectively all the resources invested in adaptation cannot compare to those in mitigation. And we're leaving aside some key sectors like building, agriculture, farming, industry that also have a very relevant input in greenhouse emissions. And that's not enough. This level of investment is not enough. To achieve the commitments in the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, we need to broaden 5 times this investment. This is one of the largest challenges that we face. Not only the private sector, but humanity as a whole. Some conclusions from the information I gave. The private sector currently represents 50% of climate financing, but adaptation represents only a 7.5% of that financing. And evidently, energy and transport represent 75% of the total financing, which, when we remember the numbers about how transport and energy use is very detrimental in terms of greenhouse emissions, there's a lot of other sectors that contribute to this as well, and we cannot set aside. This is a brief example on one of the sectors that has had great evolution, the investment in renewable energy. In 2015, it was about 1,000 billions in investments. In 2023, it has grown by 62% and is now about $1,740 billion in investment to renewable energy. There's an alignment in costs, there's more accessible technologies, clear goals in terms of energy and climate security, and of course, industry is including ever more the necessity of of energy efficiency and clean energy. There's price signals that have triggered a rapid expansion of these technologies, and that is what broadens the expansion because the more these technologies are needed, the more the price is lower. Public policies have been trying to make these technologies more accessible. Also, the energy crisis has accelerated the investment in the last 2 years, inspired by geopolitical conflicts and the necessity of energy efficiency. This investment is not consistent, however. It's not the same in every sector or every country, so public policies have to address this topic to guarantee a uniform transition. In terms of financing costs, it's a key issue right now. The funds available are not great and are not profitable. Different types of technologies that are required. We also need to assure that they are involved in the value chain, that there is enough resources, that the productive processes are standardized, and that the substitution technologies are there. There's still a lot to face in terms of time, lack of incentives, tax burdens, among other factors. So, to sum up, of course, there's a lot of working conditions that will allow us to fast track the transition from the private sector to these new technologies, a new way of development. But with all the challenges, the climate conditions, from our different perspectives, to fast track this process, we have different actions. For example, access to financing and investments with good conditions. In other words, cheap funds that will allow to reduce emissions and make them profitable to the private sector. Public policies and regulation. We need that these new technologies have a framework of regulation and public policies that will foster them. This goes along with the supports and governmental incentives, economical or not. There's other options as well to strengthen this recognition. For example, the report programs, which there's a lot of, but I would want to highlight carbon neutrality programs, roadmaps to climate action. For example, in Costa Rica, we have a lot of experiences that have been great in terms of technological transition in the short and long term. For example, net zero, that has a few methods, science-based targets, and something that is a lot more complex coming up, which is the environmental declarations of products. We have to see what's going on, for example, in European markets, in which we're already seeing these market impacts. The public, private, and private partnerships. We have alliances in Costa Rica that join champions of the private sector working in their communities, and that they demonstrate that we can achieve a lot of more results working together, as well as the support of international cooperation. We have to generate capacities, pilot programs. International cooperation has a lot of challenges yet to come. And cross-cuttingly, we also have to increase capacity building. Some of the greater challenges we have in terms of introducing new technologies in the markets that are cheaper is that they are not known. Businesses are afraid of this transition and that it won't work out. And we still need more data, more information to foster these new technologies. So I think we have a few ideas, and we're going to dive into the panel to see how we can promote the generation of these enabling conditions from the different perspectives to lead as fast as possible an investment of the private sector in climate action. Laura, thank you very much for all the context you gave us. We're going to open the dialogue right now. And they're going to tell us what they're working with. And here's why we have Benjamin Schaefer. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone, for being here today. We have to exchange good practices and experiences on how to boost the private contributions to climate action. For those who didn't hear, my name is Benjamin Schaefer. I'm the regional coordinator of NDC Action in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I also work with the Basilea Agency for Sustainable Energy as a consultant. For the next 40 minutes, we have certain goals. Talk about the experiences of our experts from different backgrounds, the private finance sectors, civil society, and also the multilateral sectors. We want to talk about the goals achieved and also talk about the challenges we will face in the future to explore solutions and boost climate action. Before opening the floor to our distinguished panelists, I want to remember that we're going to have a Q&A session later. So to our audience, feel free to formulate your questions in the chat. So today it's a great honor to welcome our guests and panelists today. We're here today as a government representative. We have Andrea Viviana Quiñones, which is a strategy coordinator for carbon neutrality in Colombia. We also have Michelle Levy, who is the director for the environment dimension in the AED. From the private sector, we'll also have Luis Opaso, who is the general manager of the Bank and Financial Institution Association in Chile, and Margarita Gutierrez, who is the Climate Asset Outreach Initiative leader in Latin America. Lastly, we also have here today Edgar Hernan Cruz, who is a consultant in the private sector in climate finance in the NDC 5 project. To start and see what topics we're going to discuss, I would like to start with a general question to all panelists, starting with Andrea and also Michelle. So here it goes. We see that there's a lot of initiatives in cooperation in countries in the region and commitments as well from many businesses. We also see there's growth in emissions at the regional level, and that is getting us away from the possibility of achieving the 1.5 degrees goal from the Paris Agreement. From your perspective, we would like to know how we can fast track the investment and innovation, as well as dynamism in the private sector to meet the NDCs in the region. Please, Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you. Well, among the various factors, I would like to highlight three. One is a necessity for regulation. Second, the establishment of concrete short-term goals and clear measurements. And thirdly, the strengthening of the implementation mechanisms like financing and social alliances for implementation. In Colombia, these measured sets are consigned in the action law of 2021, in which we also have to create follow-up for each of these measures. The strength that this law of climate action has given us, both for the Environment Ministry and National Planning, is to really measure the advances that have been set. Secondly, by setting goals, for example, for emission reduction for 2030, 10 years in the future, it's evident that we need to set short-term goals to help us move forward and define actions that will allow us to prioritize measures to be taken. And that's why we are fostering fast tracking for climate action with 2026 goals to achieve the 50% of the goals set for 2030. So we have 20 sector measures and 8 cross-cutting measures that will be developed in 10 different projects related, for example, with transport, mobility, electric energy, energetic transitions. And lastly, to understand that we need financing. As an environment ministry, we don't have an efficient vehicle to implement these measures without resources. For example, with the carbon tax, we have a measure to approve certain climate action projects that didn't allow us before to have a continuity in initiatives. We are seeing right now that the resources were being dispersed in terms of topics, intervention points, and we saw the need through the 2277 law, planning for biodiversity that will coordinate all the climate action projects from the ministry, and where the private sector can give their input but also gain benefits when helping achieve the goals in the NDC. Thank you, Andrea. On your Colombian perspective, you mentioned very relevant topics. The fast tracking initiative, for example, that is being fostered as well by the UNEP and other actors. Michelle, your second panelist today. I would like to hear from you. Hi. From my perspective, in the AD, which is the Development Initiative for Businesses, we join a lot of businesses in the private sector. We have 25 years of history in the sector, and our role has been to boost sustainability, both at a individual business level as well as in terms of a sector initiative, especially in terms of decarbonization and adaptation. Right now, we are at a very lucky moment because of the NDC action engagements we've had, because we have a great potential here to use the proven methodologies from this project that have given great results, and that the businesses that participated in this pilot project are not only happy with the results, but also with the resources and working methods, which are very easy to implement. Right now, as an organization, we have the opportunity to broaden this and boost these tools, not only for the 20 businesses that also had access, but our 110 businesses through direct support and training, so that each business can create a roadmap. We have concrete methods. Firstly, using these materials so that a significant number of 30 more companies develop the roadmaps, and through that, using them as they are in different sectors to work in a sectorial level, which has a great track in this and an articulation potential. So not only working one-on-one so that each business can contribute to the NDCs, but also to articulate mechanisms and spaces for sectorial intervention. We're going to carry this out because we have the tools that really, not only the tools, but also the data from this project to provide the private sector with what they need to carry this systematically and relatively easily, which helps a lot. And having other businesses who already use these methods and can mentor new companies is going to be very useful in mobilization. So our commitment is directly that, and not related specifically to AD companies, We don't have that muscle to move them as fast, but we can keep participating in forums to transmit and share this knowledge and foster this methodology. So, from my perspective, this is a very practical initiative that we have the duty to carry out to contribute to this energy transition in Costa Rica. I would leave it at that right now. We want to take theory to action. That is our goal right now in the AD, to put into action all this knowledge from the project we already implemented before at an association level and foster actions, because each business involved can help as a spokesperson to other companies and mentoring. It's going to be a chain. I agree with all the data that you have presented. We're going slowly. It's a kind of sad reality, to not to say, disencouraging. But we have to focus on action, concrete action, focused in goals that we already have at the national level, and capitalize in instruments and data and information that we already have and can provide solutions to move forward our businesses in these issues. Thank you for your answer, Michelle, and for sharing your experience in the AD, in what companies go through in the transition from theory to action in climate action, to create roadmaps in decarbonization and climate resiliency. With that in mind, I would like to give the floor to Luis Opaso so that he can share his perspective. Thank you, Benjamin, and all of those who organized this seminar. And just to give some context, I think that it's good to emphasize that at a global level, climate change is happening faster than we anticipated. And we don't have a very positive perspective. All the reasonable measures in the medium term are being challenged today, and the perspectives call for more immediate action. And this is very complex because the solutions are not evident in the short term. And the effects are being seen today. I just want to point out that after a prolonged drought, one of the most profound in Chile in the last years, this year we had floods, very severe, who had a direct impact in the month of June, which uh, really costed a lot. Also, forest fires to 900 millions from our financing. We have a very bleak perspective in the northern area, which has been very affected. We have a rise in 2 degrees Celsius, and we're not setting goals in the long term, really. And in this way, the financial world is key to implement climate action into our institutions. And I want to emphasize something. It is key to measure the different measurable activities in Chile, different inclusions to incorporate into their actions, the impact on sustainability. But we don't have a standards methodology, which I think is one of the main challenges. We have to implement standardized and accepted methodologies that allow us to incorporate in three dimensions. product and service design. For example, commercial uh, in incorporating green components in products. For example, how to commercialize these products to close gaps or not. Of course, also within these impacts in financial management, financing schemes which are more necessary every day to seek that the resources, for example, by green bonds, are targeted to activities for climate fight. We have to see how much this helps. Everything helps, of course, but how more we could um, do to get closer to these goals. And that is why what you mentioned is key. And also in terms of financing management, the in-house management of businesses, not only institutional goals in the people who are in charge, for example, of commercial decisions, but also in performance reports. And we should also focus this in community actions, not only direct commercial activities, but also mitigation of climate consequences in communities. From my perspective, we have advanced a lot, but there's still room for improvement. And I think that the main element that will help us accelerate this change in the finance sector is to have standardized methodologies that will allow us to measure what measures are viable in the short and long term. And this is not underway. Aside from the public policies that are being fostered in the country, we have moved forward a lot in terms of commitments. For example, banks with net zero commitments are about 75% of the banking sector. For every 4 pesos managed by the banks, 75% are of net zero commitment banks, which is very important when you see Latin American rankings in particular. Both Chile and Mexico have very important advancements in these areas, which I think is incredible. But although we have products, services, financing mechanisms associated with sustainability goals, the challenge right now for us as a country is to have a common methodology to allow us to have certainties in how we should move forward and be more efficient to a financing scheme that will be more sustainable. This is my summary of the challenges in this matter. Thank you very much for your valuable input and the ABIF perspective, as well as the cost and benefits. I would like to give the floor to Margarita from Transforma to give us her perspective. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. We have 3 main points. One of the most important challenges is, or the things we've done, is to use the platforms that are already available. In the private sector, there's a lot of people wanting to address these issues and be engaged. But to do this in an organized manner, for example, Acadi, where we work with investors in strengthening their capacities to use the recommendations of climate actions related with their businesses, we have the participation of the Mexican platforms of sustainable development, and the responsible investment policies. We have to join efforts and build on what we already have. Another thing is the flow of information. Although it's always been critical, being able to understand how the different public, environment, private sectors intertwine and generate joint experiences with knowledge sharing is still a bit challenging. We have advanced in this manner, but we have not yet achieved our goals to translate these climate models and adapting them into business models. We still have a lot of challenges. And another subject on building on what we already have, like Laura said, is converting what comes ahead and the way in which we're going to face these challenges. We have to align ourselves from climate action and understand that we have to become a business opportunity, give economic benefits, and use, for example, the need in diversification of investments in Latin America, which is very important for the stocks in Peru, Colombia, and Chile, and use this as a platform to understand how we can build together opportunities that will help us all and that are intertwined among each other. Thank you, Margarita, for your contribution. I think you mentioned very clear challenges, improving information flows, and how to diversify investments to foster the intervention of the private sector in climate action. I would like to talk then with Edgar to close with this first round of questions. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Benjamin, and hi to my colleagues and participants. A key matter in our work in Central America with the private sector, we carried out a poll to unions to see what they thought about NDCs and climate action. The key result was coherent with what we're seeing, that 90% of unions said our associates have experienced economic losses related or caused by climate phenomena. And this breaks down into lesser profitability of businesses and less gains, something that Luis mentioned, also problems of the productive and private sector to meet financial expectations, and also the moment in which the private sector had to rebuild their assets to continue with their productive activities. We faced a lot of depreciation from this climate crisis in our assets, and we also had reports of businesses closing down because of them. So, when facing this situation and having NDCs and national plans, which are a baseline for climate action, and knowing that we have to escalate climate actions, well, where should we as the private sector then start working on this transformation of these situations and managing these costs and risks? So, firstly, including a value chain perspective. If in the case of Central America, integration of countries and exports, but this is paramount. Secondly, in terms of growth, only 22% of unions told us that they had centers for training and support that help us with our associates to work on climate initiatives. So this is an invitation with the public and private initiatives on how to build on these capacities. We have seen very important experiences in the business sector and unions that are already working on solving concrete climate change problems, fostering mitigation solutions, adaptation solutions, even with early detection systems. So a key point is fast tracking these processes at the business level because basically we have a phenomenon that is already affecting us financially. And it is our turn to incorporate into business models answers to climate change that will protect employment, tax deadlines, productivity, and that will help us maintain the recipient countries' economies. Thank you, Edgar, for your intervention and your experiences from the NDC 5 to incorporate all these considerations in the business models of businesses. With this, we're going to close the first part of our panel and we're going to move forward with specific techniques. So I would like to hear um, uh, every participant and encourage you to speak loudly so our translation can be carried out better. We're looking forward for all your intervention. Andrea, we're going to start with you. What is the experience in Colombia to mobilize the private sector in organization, adaptation, resiliency, and how are they articulated with government priorities? Thank you. Firstly, I was going to talk more in depth about adaptation, so I'm going to start with this. I would like to share that a second poll in industry and the environment carried out in 2021, and that included different organizations, showed that only 2% of these organizations are implementing adaptation strategies. So we see that the right path is very challenging. And we see what Laura said of going from theory to action. What has been Colombia's experience? Well, we revamped our structures in biodiversity, social change, and also addressing the most urgent challenges in terms of equity and safety, which was introduced in our third climate change initiative by identifying what were our country's priorities in terms of adaptation. And we set 30 initiatives distributed in 7 sectors like energy, environment, food, industry, transport, and they were consigned in the law I mentioned before. Currently, through this compliance of the regulations, we are following up on the advances of each one of these measures set. And within the programs and initiatives led in the governmental side and that have impacted in the private sector, we can highlight, for example, an initiative at a regional level led by the Environment Authority, LAC, and also the Andes University, were organizations that shared the same hydrographic basins could join to formulate projects of resource management in a comprehensive way. It entailed protection, ecosystem restoration, as well as deforestation. It is very interesting because a lot of different businesses were involved at different levels, different sizes. But in this case, they all had a common goal. They shared a same geographical location and therefore served the same ecosystems. Another initiative today is the Green Productivity Initiative, led by the Industry and Commerce Ministry. And they are working in strengthening capacities for organizations and helping them with adaptation plans. It started last year, and we are seeing the data right now. And lastly, the Carbon Neutrality National Project, being led by the Environment Ministry. It started 2 years ago, and this program is a first-time initiative directly with the private sector to boost the NDCs. And it comes from this initial goal that I mentioned of decarbonization. It was carried out by the Bogota agency that said that 86% didn't know what carbon neutrality was, 57% didn't know what the NDCs were. And therefore, of course, we started strengthening the capacity and knowledge of these organizations, especially in terms of mitigation, by measuring greenhouse gas inventories, for example. And yet we see the need to continue with our information campaigns and working in adaptation. Sorry, Andrea, could you move closer to the microphone because we can't hear you? Yes, we are planning to work with thousands of organizations in the next few years in formulating plans and projects in terms of concrete adaptation. Thank you, Andrea, for your complete answer and sharing the experience of the Colombian government. Specifically about the governmental initiatives in terms of green contribution and carbon neutrality, I would like to uh, move with Michelle with the next question related to these matters. Michelle, in the AD, with your experience, what types of incentives and policies, as well as other instruments, like what Andrea mentioned, you think are necessary to ensure leadership actively fast in the achievement of NDCs by the private sector? Yes, well, before starting with incentives, I think it's important to highlight uh, something we realized from experience working with companies, and that is well documented in studies. It's about knowledge. To do, you have to know. To take action, you have to understand the why, the how. And yet, at a business level in Costa Rica and globally, this is well documented, as I said, there's not enough knowledge of what is going on in terms of climate change and how we can act practically, tangibly We always suppose that this knowledge is there because we work with these matters, but the reality is that at a mass level, people don't know that much about the subject. It's really not there. So I think it's very interesting, and we can't leave behind in a world of incentive. Well, that's great, but if we stop informing and most effectively and in a day-to-day basis by really explaining this information so that it can be understood by everyone, then we don't have uh, a working incentive program, because we won't have people saying, well, why do I need that? How do I gain any benefit from that? So I think it's very important to highlight that in the incentive package or any action we carry out, at the base level, we have communication. Imagine if communicating the problem of climate change could be as effective as communicating, for example, Coca-Cola or Apple strategies. We would have a different conversation right now. And I don't mean dumbing down the information. I mean that there's so much information presented in ways that are not easily understandable. And we keep working on these details of more or less decarbonization, this technology versus another, which are very important, but in the big picture are not going to help boost the business contributions. People are there like, well, what do I do now? I don't understand. So I wouldn't rule it out in this incentive project. Being better at innovating and communicating our problems at a very specific and concrete level, and really explaining and summing it up to the important and urgent matters. Not everyone needs to know everything. We have to be clear in what we need to communicate and what we're going to offer a business so that they can act accordingly. And in our experience, what we heard most in these companies that are already working with us is the financial necessity. For example, in Costa Rica, we have to extend finance solutions, for example, incentives in terms of loans or tax deductions that will help companies that are really decarbonizing. For example, there's a lot of experiences of businesses that need to change their boilers, and they are not cheap. To make that change, businesses will need to incur in significant costs that are not accessible at any given time. If we have tax incentives, for example, that boilers are tax free, or even loans, bank loans, not only for boilers, but other technologies that could really offer favorable interests and other components within this loan that could favor these companies, which are working, trying to decarbonize and make this energy transition. In this, I include the possibility, I don't know if the government or other sources of grants that will allow a company to access these funds and investment in initiatives to make this energy transition possible. So this financial component is something we keep hearing at a business level. How can we make these changes without them becoming a financial problem for us? That will not weaken the business, but maybe are one of the factors that are delaying the change. Hmm. So if there's opportunity, to ease the change at a financial level, then we would see more action, especially in businesses that are already trying to make this transition. Another area is recognition. Not necessarily, wow, great job, diplomas, but recognizing these achievements and that will have tangible consequences. For example, a sum of money that will allow them to invest in the continuity of their climate resiliency programs, or some type of recognition that somehow will have an impact on the consumer and will allow what this company does, the product or service they provide, will make it more attractive for consumers, whether they use or buy this good or service. So having recognition that has real consequences and translate in keeping on scaling climate resiliency. And that a company is assured that what they're doing in their decarbonation process is really being embraced by the audience and will be beneficial for the company. And just to close, I would also include, we're behind time. Well, let me check my notes, sorry, because that's very important. But we could include also insurance benefits related for with climate resiliency. First, that insurances really meet the risks in different countries and geographies, because a country like Costa Rica, even if it's very small, it doesn't face the same risk. It impacts this different businesses depending on the type and where they are located in the country. So if we could have a larger portfolio of um, different um, interest rates as well for the companies to ensure that the company, which is as important in energy transitions, to improve climate resiliency. So I want to highlight, to sum up, we need to inform and really support in this learning process. I know it sounds really shocking at this instance that we're still having to explain the message, but that's a reality. There's a lot of businesses that still today don't understand what's going on and how they connect. They have a big idea, we should maybe do this or that, but they don't understand how. And that is a comprehensive action for a higher purpose. And they don't understand that higher purpose either, where it comes from. So, fiscal incentives, recognition programs that will translate in tangible benefits, keep informing in a concrete basis with support to accompany this transition process. I think one of the panelists mentioned this, that it's important to support this capacity building and move it into action. So it's not just about incentive, it's a combination of factors. And in an ideal world, they have to be implemented jointly. So perhaps we have been great in the past, generating data, information, but we need to transmit this to people create incentives, and take all this knowledge into action where it's necessary. Create even more recognition programs. And I'm going to leave it at that because there's a lot I want to say. I am engaged, although I haven't heard it from the private sector specifically, but my personal opinion, and I think our Colombian colleagues said, there's a need for regulation as well. What is set by the NDCs? Rules about energy efficiency, uh, decarbonization goals in laws, or you're going to face consequences. But it wouldn't be fair because that's not necessarily what I had heard for the private sector, but it could help them. Thank you so much, Michelle. I think there's at least three, four important points. The communication challenge you mentioned, the financial challenge, thirdly, the recognition in tangible terms, and finally, in terms of insurance. And specifically with the second point, we're going to move on with Luis. Remember, we only have 5 more minutes, so please, if you could keep it short. I know you have a lot to say, but Luis, could you see important developments in the Chilean financial sector, such as an implementation of the Green Agreement or a tension with the association in terms of responsible banking and the NDC 5? In terms of these developments, we would like to ask, what is the main goal of ABIF? So we have a strategy alignment with banks in under the Paris Agreement. I'll try to keep it brief. Like you said, as a banking association, we promote sustainable financing. One of our main obstacles have been incorporating the different variables in terms of risk to banks and foster cooperation among all actors. And from that, we have a sustainability forum where all banks participate. And that has been a challenge for exchange of the responsible banking procedures of the UN. And we also are members of the financial network of the World Bank. And the main goal of these agreements are two. Firstly, fostering development for the industry. And secondly, to channel the international experience to put them into practice with our associates. And particularly related to this taxonomy, the main challenge we face as an association and industry, and it has to do with what I said before. It's important for us to set measurements and see how each sector is doing. Otherwise, there may be good intentions, well oriented, but won't translate into metrics or real action. And it will be difficult in efficient action moving forward. I think it's fundamental to have metrics to implement and mitigate risks in a very effective way. The finance ministry has been carrying out an initiative with our bank regulators and insurance regulators, along with the private sector, to advance Chilean taxonomy. I think it's good news, but we need to accelerate it. Even if nowadays the different perspectives are based in defining a taxonomy for the real sectors like construction, engineering. We don't we can't forget that a financial perspective is related to investments and credit management, because in Chile half of our investments are targeted to families. So this approach based on economic sectors also has to contemplate how this financing is having a sustainable impact. And I think I also need to highlight this taxonomy because it carries great benefits towards advancing our strategies. Firstly, in the inner management of each organization, different banks have mission goals, sustainability goals, but having a common metric will help efficiency. Also, when having cross-cutting evaluations, we need to have common metrics. And thirdly, the design of public policies. I think it's evident that public policies need to play an active role in terms of fostering sustainability, and it has to be based in metrics, evaluations, because otherwise its efficiency will be hindered if we don't have the necessary background. So I think the urgency has been mentioned by everyone. And so we aspire as an industry to an advance in the short and medium term, particularly in terms of these metrics, to have better information and better public policies. And having as a north that we have to have a long-term approach as well. But we need changes now. Thank you. We understand this necessity to keep working on taxonomies, to have the necessary metrics for the financial sector and private sector in general. So, Margarita, the next question. Sorry, we have 4 minutes. So please, if you could keep it brief with the last two interventions with concrete answers. I'm so sorry with this time problem. But based on the work you have carried out in terms of the Paris Agreement, I would like to ask from your perspective, what is the challenge facing uh, in the countries that you operate and in terms of implementation? Margarita, the floor is yours. Yes, we face two challenges that are very complemental what Michelle and Luis said. First, appropriation by each party of these objectives, and we need the private sector to understand the dimensions, how they are affected by climate change. And as well as Michelle, I agree that one of the biggest challenges is that businesses don't know what an NDC is, don't know what information they bring, what are the priorities. So I think it's a term of it's a matter of appropriation. And for Luis, in terms of the clients of the financial sector, that the demand is what moves the world. So the clients of every part of the private sector have to know as well what an NDC is, how it affects us, and why it's important to our countries to meet them. And so the LACADI has contributed a lot with information, training, capacity building in countries like Mexico and Colombia. And also, I want to highlight that an important challenge is implementation. because there's still not a design of how this should be reflected in the markets and how it could be financed through different types of funds. And here I think that we have learned to understand from the financial sector what institutional investors need in terms of their own risks to climate change, like biophysical changes for facing these geopolitical changes in markets as well. And that they can know what is related to the NDC. If there's adaptation or mitigation goals, how can they transform them into capable and concrete projects? Especially in Mexico, the LAC team works a lot in understanding how to get it down from the financial cloud, those NDC priorities, and how to turn them into financing ideas. And what other countries propose is that we have a chapter surrounding investments that will help us fill the gap. There's other concrete cases to mobilize implementation, for example, insurance. We have two specific measures that require that the main insurers have the knowledge and understand how they can change their practices and invest. And therefore, we have advanced the capability building and knowledge sharing in the insurance sector. And just to close, uh, in terms of financial products, in Colombia, Lagadi developed a public list of financial products for the whole country so that those who want to understand how to invest in mitigation activities have a clear map onto where they can get those resources. And that will help to meet the NDC. Thank you. Yes, this necessity to really put into action these theories and bring them down from the cloud is key. Finally, Edgar, a last question. From your experience, what elements are paramount to set a working agenda, strengthening public private partnerships, and achieve the effective implementation of NDCs? Yes, well, a key point each country has a different evolution in terms of how the private and public sector debate and dialogue. We want them to have robust and joint dialogue platforms. For example, in the Dominican Republic, we have a business forum, which is really a place of exchange in public and private partnerships, and they are advancing collaboratively and cooperating. So we have to advance in these dialogue spaces. And another key aspect, think about governance, how it will be developed, what goal it will have. And of course, these have metrics, and we have to think it in terms of climate change. Sometimes we talk about low carbon, but to the private sector, it should be how can we transform a business so that it can continue to be profitable and so that they continue to grow in a context being navigated by climate change. So have to integrate this understanding of the reality of the private sector. And in terms of enabling conditions, without innovation and new knowledge that can be applied in businesses to create new packaging, new water use, we're not going to meet our goals. The private sector is innovating. And finally, how do we measure and realize that we're going in the right direction? We have to develop platforms and protocols to verify. and check if we're meeting these goals. And finally, in terms of comprehensive climate change plans that include businesses, that each decarbonation, mitigation, climate resiliency initiatives or business continuity plans that are linked to the Sendai protocol have to be there. And that businesses uh, are very clear in terms of where to go. Thank you so much, Edgar. I think it's very important to remember the importance of metrics and controls as well as innovation. I think this concludes our presentation. Thank you, our fellow panelists, for being here today and for everyone listening. So we're going to move on to the last section of our meeting. Daniel, thank you, and Camille. And from the UNEP, we would like to thank all participants in today's panel to inform and take these discussions to our audience. And in agreeing with this, we want to invite them to the sixth dialogue in terms of electric mobility that will be carried out next Tuesday. And we expect them there so that we can deal with this important topic. We want to thank you for being here today, and we will see you on Tuesday, hopefully. Thank you.